the motorcycle world just witnessed a betrayal, or a rebirth. Harley-Davidson's CEO didn't deliver an update. He detonated a century of tradition with one statement that left veterans gasping, investors scrambling, and rivals completely blindsided. What you're about to hear wasn't supposed to reach riders this way, and if you miss it, you'll be stuck wondering why the industry collapsed around you while others saw it coming. If you own a Harley, dream of riding one, or simply want to understand the shockwaves now shaking motorcycling's very foundation, this affects you more than you think. Stay with me until the end, because the revelations ahead build step by step, and the final one changes everything you thought you knew about Harley, its rivals, and the future of motorcycling itself. The reveal. The motorcycle world thrives on noise, engines roaring, crowds cheering, chrome catching sunlight. But sometimes the loudest moment arrives in silence. That silence came when Harley-Davidson's chief executive stepped to the podium and shattered a century of expectation with one declaration. In a single breath, the man at the top told riders, investors, and rivals alike, the old playbook was gone. No cautious adjustments, no hedging, just a thunderclap strategy designed to rip the road out from under the entire industry. For generations, Harley's identity was so fixed it seemed untouchable. Heavyweight cruisers, thunderous pipes, the smell of gasoline stitched into the brand's very fabric. Yet here was leadership not whispering about change, but detonating it. The announcement was not an incremental upgrade, it was a reckoning. Harley wasn't waiting for disruption to arrive. It was firing the first shot. It dared competitors to react, dared riders to choose, dared the entire culture of motorcycling to face a future it had long denied. The reaction was instant. Veteran riders gasped, forums exploded, and analysts scrambled to rewrite forecasts. Some called it betrayal, others called it salvation. What everyone agreed on was that Harley had made the boldest move in its history. And that moment, the reveal, was not just another headline. It was the spark of a battle that would redraw the map of motorcycling forever, and its echo was only beginning to shake the ground. Demographic crossroads. For decades, Harley's brand power rested on the loyalty of middle-aged and older riders. These were customers who bought large cruisers, loaded them with chrome, and invested in the culture as much as the machine. But those riders were aging out of the market. The average Harley buyer was already well into his 50s, and younger enthusiasts were not replacing them at the same pace. Motorcycling itself was facing cultural headwinds, from rising insurance costs to shifting leisure habits. For Harley, the math was unavoidable. Without younger customers, the pipeline of new riders would run dry, and with it, the future of the brand. The new strategy confronted this reality head-on. The company's leadership made clear that Harley's survival depended on courting a generation raised in cities, raised on efficiency, and raised on value. These riders had different expectations than the boomers who once defined motorcycle culture. They wanted machines that were approachable, stylish, and financially attainable without losing authenticity. Harley could no longer assume that nostalgia would do the selling. Instead, it needed to build a credible bridge to people who might be buying their very first motorcycle. The risk was obvious. Older loyalists might see this as dilution, while younger prospects might still hesitate. But the alternative, clinging to a shrinking base, was untenable. The crossroads was more than marketing strategy. It was survival disguised as reinvention. If Harley failed to connect with younger riders now, the brand's lineage risked becoming a museum piece. Winning over the next generation meant rewriting destiny, ensuring the roar of Harley would echo beyond the current era. It was against this backdrop that Harley chose to resurrect a name from its archives, a model that once symbolized agility and accessibility. The stage was set for the return of the Sprint. If you're hooked by how this story is unfolding, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Do you think Harley's bold move is genius or reckless? Sprint heritage. The Sprint was not a new invention. Its roots stretched back to the 1960s, when Harley partnered with Ermacchi in Italy to produce smaller displacement motorcycles that could appeal to younger riders and compete in global racing circuits. The Harley-Davidson Sprint quickly became known for its nimble frame, competitive edge, and accessibility compared to heavyweight cruisers. It carved out a niche, both in European markets and among American riders who wanted something less intimidating than the massive touring bikes. Although eventually discontinued, the Sprint left behind a cultural echo, remembered fondly by collectors and historians as the Harley that dared to be different. Bringing the Sprint name back was more than nostalgia. It was a deliberate signal that Harley understood the symbolic power of heritage. The Sprint carried associations of speed, versatility, and entry-level accessibility, all of which aligned perfectly with the demographic goals now driving corporate strategy. By invoking this model, Harley was telling riders that it was not abandoning its past, but reinterpreting it for a new era. The Sprint name was a bridge between decades, reminding enthusiasts that Harley had once experimented, adapted, and won hearts outside the heavyweight class. In a marketplace often obsessed with novelty, Harley chose continuity as its weapon. Reviving the Sprint was not nostalgia for its own sake. It was a calculated bet that history could become a weapon in the present. By leveraging a name etched in racing lore, Harley reframed its pivot as continuity, convincing skeptics that evolution was simply tradition reshaped for modern roads. Still, a name could not carry the burden alone. If the Sprint was to succeed in the 21st century, Harley had to make it attainable in a way that spoke louder than history, and that meant turning to price as the decisive weapon. Before we jump ahead, a lot of you ask what I actually use. I pulled a short list: helmet, gloves, and lock. Budget-friendly and tested. Skip the guesswork. Scroll to the description. Everything's linked so you can upgrade smart. Price warfare. Motorcycles are emotional purchases, but for many potential riders, the decision begins with a calculator. Harley's revelation included a bold financial strategy, an entry-level motorcycle positioned below the psychological barrier of $10,000. For a brand long associated with premium pricing, this was revolutionary. By cutting the cost of entry, Harley aimed to remove the most formidable obstacle for younger and first-time buyers. Affordability, combined with recognizable design and cultural cachet, had the potential to convert curiosity into ownership. In a market where Japanese competitors had dominated the small displacement space for decades, this move reset the battlefield. The implications were immediate. Analysts pointed out that a sub-$10,000 Harley could siphon customers who might otherwise buy a used import or a budget commuter. Financing options would suddenly look less daunting. Insurance premiums would be more manageable, and the barrier to entry for a Harley lifestyle would be dramatically lowered. Competitors would be forced to respond, either by slashing prices or by attempting to differentiate in other ways. The announcement transformed Harley from a brand often criticized for being out of touch into a disruptive force, challenging the very structure of motorcycle pricing. And riders everywhere now faced a stark new reality. Harley had redefined what accessibility meant. The shock went deeper than price tags. It carried a psychological edge, reminding riders that Harley was no longer reserved for the wealthy few. Ownership could now be a realistic dream, and that shift turned the brand into something even more dangerous to its rivals, an aspiration within reach. But this was only the opening salvo. The announcement had shaken the ground. Demographics demanded attention. The Sprint name returned from history, and price had been weaponized. Yet the real test would come in how rivals, governments, and cultures responded to this bold detonation. The shockwave was only beginning. Asian rivals. For decades, the small displacement motorcycle segment has been dominated by the Japanese giants. Honda and Yamaha perfected the art of affordable, reliable, and approachable machines that became the first ride for millions across Asia, Europe, and North America. These bikes built reputations not on thunder or spectacle, but on practicality, commuting ease, fuel efficiency, and repair simplicity. Honda's CB line and Yamaha's MT series created near-automatic loyalty, with riders often sticking to the brand for life. Against this backdrop, Harley-Davidson's push into this territory was more than ambitious. It was audacious. The company that once represented heavyweight exclusivity was now marching directly onto the turf where Japanese rivals had ruled unchallenged. Harley's strategy unsettled competitors. By offering an American-branded entry-level machine, it threatened to siphon buyers who wanted both practicality and cultural cachet. Honda and Yamaha had built their dominance on rationality, but Harley was injecting emotion into the same price band. Suddenly, a first-time rider considering a Japanese commuter could ask, why not start with a Harley instead? That question rattled an industry comfortable with its segmentation. To the Japanese brands, the message was clear. Harley was not content with heavyweight prestige. It was invading the commuter battlefield with the power of heritage. And as Honda and Yamaha recalibrated, another rival prepared a very different answer. Indian's counter. If Harley was willing to slim down and enter new territory, Indian Motorcycle was determined to draw a line in the sand. Indian has long positioned itself as the alternative for riders who value loud V-twin engines, deep heritage, and a sense of classic American identity. Where Harley was experimenting with lighter frames and affordability, Indian chose to double down on tradition. The company rolled out campaigns that highlighted the roar of displacement, the craftsmanship of its cruisers, and the legacy of its name stretching back to the early 1900s. It framed itself as the last true guardian of loud freedom, appealing directly to riders unnerved by Harley's willingness to change. This positioning had tactical benefits. Disaffected Harley purists who bristled at smaller displacement talk suddenly had a home across the street. Indian courted them with machines that promised the feel of rebellion untouched by compromise. The strategy was clear. If Harley became a bridge to a new generation, Indian would become the fortress of the old guard. That fortress might not grow as quickly, but it would hold fiercely to its base. In doing so, Indian aimed to transform Harley's pivot into its own advantage. Yet heritage alone could not determine global success. Beyond the United States, another proving ground loomed where compliance and regulation mattered as much as culture. Europe's test. Europe has always been a complex market for Harley-Davidson, and the new entry-level push intensified that complexity. The European Union's licensing tiers, particularly the A2 license, imposed strict limits on displacement and horsepower for younger riders. Any new Harley entering the region had to align with these rules, or risk being shut out of a massive segment of first-time buyers. Beyond licensing, emissions regulations grew more stringent year after year, creating hurdles that demanded precise engineering and consistent adaptation. Harley was not simply competing for riders' attention, it was competing against a regulatory maze designed to shape what motorcycles could even be sold. Cultural expectations added another layer. European riders valued practicality, maneuverability in dense cities, and cost-efficient ownership. Harley's heavy cruisers rarely met those tests, which is why the brand had struggled to gain the same dominance it enjoyed in the United States. An approachable machine that respected European rules and offered American cachet could shift that balance. If Harley could succeed in cities like Paris or Berlin, it would prove that its pivot was more than American posturing. It was global repositioning. But rules and riders are only half the battle. The front lines of this shift would be fought not in government halls, but in the dealerships where curiosity had to become sales. Dealerships on the front line. No strategy, however bold, survives without translation at the point of sale. For Harley, that meant dealerships shouldering the burden of reinvention. Dealers had long thrived on selling large cruisers, outfitting them with chrome accessories, and building community through events. The entry-level strategy demanded a very different playbook. Sales teams had to pivot from guiding experienced enthusiasts to educating first-time buyers about insurance, safety, and financing. That shift required new training, new messaging, and a new mindset. A dealership that once thrived on loyalty and nostalgia had to become a classroom for rookies while still retaining veterans. Service departments also faced change. Smaller displacement machines meant different maintenance rhythms, faster turnaround, and the need for technicians trained in multiple product tiers. For dealers, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. By embracing the entry-level wave, they could seed loyalty early and nurture it through trade-up programs. By resisting, they risked missing out on the very customers who would define Harley's future. The company's gamble depended on dealerships adapting with agility and conviction. And while they wrestled with that burden, rivals across the globe were not standing still. The industry scramble was accelerating, and the outcome would determine who defined the next decade of motorcycling. The first ride stakes. Every motorcycle makes its case the moment the throttle twists, and for Harley-Davidson's newest creation, that first surge carried the weight of history. The ergonomics had to feel welcoming yet authoritative, striking a balance between approachability and Harley's signature stance. Riders who swung a leg over were met with a geometry that felt both familiar and fresh, a seat height low enough to invite confidence, a triangle that kept arms and legs relaxed, and handlebars positioned for control rather than intimidation. Confidence per mile became the mantra. Every angle, every control, every contour was engineered to invite trust in those first critical moments on the road. The throttle response told its own story. Instead of delivering power in a timid, delayed manner, the machine offered a clear and steady surge of torque. It was not about blinding speed, but about honesty, the kind of push that reassured rather than frightened. Tank range added another layer, designed to cover daily commutes and weekend escapes without constant refueling. Comfort extended beyond numbers. It was about the absence of distraction, the way the chassis communicated predictability, and the tires translated pavement into stability. The first ride proved that Harley had not built a novelty, but a genuine machine. And once that baseline was secured, attention naturally shifted to the financial realities that would decide its broader fate. Ownership economics. Emotion draws a rider to a motorcycle, but economics keep them there. For the new Harley, the financial equation had to work as carefully as the engineering. Insurance classes mattered first. A smaller displacement machine landed in brackets that were far less punishing than the heavyweight cruisers of old, opening the door to a new population of riders who could finally afford to join. Fuel economy followed, with figures that stretched miles further per gallon than traditional Harleys, ensuring that everyday use would not feel like an extravagance. Riders who once balked at constant fuel stops now saw range as a point of practicality. Service costs offered another advantage. Regular maintenance was less demanding, with simplified intervals and more accessible components. Technicians reported quicker turnarounds, meaning owners spent less time off the road and more time enjoying their machines. Over the span of several years, the savings accumulated into real dollars that reinforced the purchase decision. Resale value, long a hallmark of Harley's brand, remained intact. Even at a lower entry point, the badge carried enough cultural weight to preserve second-hand demand. Altogether, the economics painted a picture of accessibility without sacrifice. Harley had created a motorcycle that was not just an emotional lure, but a rational choice. And once owners were drawn into the fold, the company's strategy became clear. Use the Sprint as the first rung in a larger ladder that pointed straight toward touring dominance. The ladder to touring. Harley-Davidson has always been defined by its touring machines, those massive cruisers built to swallow highways and anchor the brand's culture. The entry-level model was never meant to exist in isolation. It was designed as a gateway. Owners who started with the Sprint were invited to climb through a deliberate progression. Trade-up incentives encouraged them to swap their first machine for mid-range models once their skills and confidence matured. Loyalty credits tied to dealership programs rewarded repeat buyers, turning each upgrade into a celebration rather than a chore. Harley's riding clubs reinforced the funnel, offering community and camaraderie that made trading up feel like a rite of passage. Touring upgrades were framed not as replacements, but as natural milestones. Riders who began with short commutes eventually imagined themselves crossing states, and Harley was there to provide the next machine for that dream. Accessories, from luggage systems to comfort seats, extended the narrative of growth, ensuring that the journey upward felt continuous. The Sprint was not only a motorcycle, it was the opening chapter of a lifestyle script that culminated in a full touring experience. But while the latter promised growth, the brand itself faced an equally important question. Could Harley maintain its identity while reshaping the path into its world? That question defined the next critical debate: the identity check. No brand carries as much symbolic weight in motorcycling as Harley-Davidson, and every new release risks tampering with that delicate image. The identity question loomed over the Sprint. Would a lighter, more accessible machine dilute the soul of Harley, or would it expand it? The answer rested in details that went beyond performance. Recognizable design cues were preserved deliberately: the muscular tank shape, the assertive stance, the paint schemes that echoed heritage without feeling dated. Riders glancing across a parking lot could still say, without hesitation, that it was a Harley. That instant recognition mattered as much as torque or range. Sound, long a signature, posed its own challenge. Regulations limited volume, but engineers sculpted the exhaust to carry a tone that hinted at Harley's legacy without crossing compliance lines. Paint finishes, metal accents, and badge placement reinforced continuity. In sum, the Sprint walked a tightrope between accessibility and authenticity, proving that identity could evolve without vanishing. For longtime observers, it answered the nagging doubt. Harley had not built a copycat commuter. It had built a true Harley scaled for a different rider. And with that reassurance, the conversation could finally expand beyond ride, math, and identity into the broader ripples shaking investors, supply chains, and labor forces across the globe. Wall Street watchers. In the end, motorcycles are sold on emotion, but markets trade on predictability. Wall Street analysts reacted to Harley-Davidson's announcement with a blend of surprise and cautious optimism. The central question was not whether the Sprint could win hearts, but whether it could stabilize volumes quarter after quarter. For years, Harley's financial story had been one of volatility, with surges tied to new releases and painful slumps when the catalog grew stale. The Sprint, positioned as an accessible entry point, promised a steadier stream of unit sales that could smooth those financial swings. Investors love nothing more than consistency, and the potential of recurring demand from first-time buyers offered just that. The parts and apparel segments added another dimension. Every new motorcycle sale tended to bring accessories, riding gear, and service packages along with it. A higher throughput of units meant increased cross-sales in categories that carried generous margins. Leadership transitions reassured some shareholders, particularly the arrival of a chief executive who had experience scaling consumer brands. Together, volume stability and accessory uplift painted a picture of renewed relevance. Yet financial optimism could only carry Harley so far. To deliver those results, the company had to solve the gritty realities of manufacturing, and that meant confronting the strain its supply chain was about to endure. Before we dive into the final stretch, hit subscribe now so you never miss what comes next. These stories move fast, and staying ahead is everything. Join the community, ride with us, and catch the next big reveal first. Supply chain strain. Building heavyweight cruisers in modest volumes required one set of logistics, but producing an affordable small displacement motorcycle at scale demanded another entirely. The Sprint tested Harley's supply chain like few products before it. Localization became the first dilemma. Building domestically aligned with political expectations and preserved brand credibility, but it carried higher costs that threatened already slim margins. Importing components or assembling offshore could cut expenses, but it risked alienating buyers who valued Harley's American identity. Balancing heritage with economic pragmatism was a tightrope that left little room for missteps. Sourcing pressures magnified the challenge. Engines, frames, and electronic systems required suppliers who could guarantee both volume and consistency. A single bottleneck could ripple across dealerships worldwide, turning anticipation into frustration. Margin management added further tension. To keep the Sprint below the psychological barrier of $10,000, Harley had to shave costs in manufacturing without sacrificing the fit and finish that defined its reputation. Analysts warned that the company would be judged not only on product appeal but on operational discipline. Harley's gamble could collapse if factories stumbled. And factories, of course, are powered by people. That brought the focus squarely onto the workforce, which now faced a transformation of its own. Labor's stand. No supply chain, however efficient, can function without a willing and capable workforce. For Harley, the shift toward producing a higher volume of smaller displacement machines forced dramatic changes on the shop floor. Mechanics who had spent careers mastering large engines now faced retraining in new assembly methods, tighter tolerances, and different maintenance rhythms. Unions recognized immediately that this was more than a technical update. It was a political moment. Workers demanded retraining guarantees to protect their long-term employability, wage protections to reflect new certifications, and clear safety standards for handling updated manufacturing processes. They had seen too many industries promise adaptation only to deliver redundancy. Negotiations grew tense. The union's leverage rested on the fact that Harley could not afford a breakdown in production while trying to prove the Sprint's credibility. Strikes, even short ones, threatened to derail momentum at a critical moment in the company's transformation. Leadership faced a delicate balance. Satisfy labor demands to maintain goodwill or risk alienating investors with higher costs. Workers insisted they were not enemies of progress, but custodians of the brand's soul. Their message was clear. Harley's gamble could succeed only if the hands building the machines shared in the rewards. Yet even as negotiations played out, another battlefield emerged, one far less tangible but just as consequential: the culture of the rider community itself. Cultural reset. Harley-Davidson has always been more than a motorcycle company. It has been a cultural icon. The arrival of the Sprint forced a redefinition of what it meant to be a Harley rider. Inside dealerships, the clash was visible. On one side stood seasoned riders who associated Harley with heavyweight cruisers, loud pipes, and long-distance freedom. On the other stood newcomers drawn by the lower barrier of entry, eager for a badge that carried history without the intimidation of size or cost. Showrooms became arenas where nostalgia and novelty collided, sometimes in the same conversation between two prospective buyers. Globally, the perception of Harley began to shift. In markets like Europe and Asia, where smaller displacement machines were the norm, the Sprint made Harley suddenly relevant in ways it had not been for decades. Younger urban riders could now picture themselves in Harley gear without feeling out of place. The cultural reset was not about erasing tradition, but about broadening it, creating a tent big enough to house both the old guard and the new blood. Whether that reset would unite or divide remained uncertain. What was certain was that Harley's gamble had reshaped the conversation, leaving competitors scrambling and communities debating. The shockwave had spread from Wall Street to factory floors and into the very identity of the rider. So there you have it. Harley-Davidson has shaken the motorcycle world like never before, and the ripple effects are only beginning. But this story isn't finished, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Smash that like button if today's journey gave you something to think about. Drop your take in the comments. I want to hear where you stand. And most importantly, hit subscribe right now. The next chapter is coming fast, and you'll want a front row seat. Comment your thoughts below, and most importantly, subscribe now. Because when the future of riding arrives, you'll want to be the first to know.